Today I will be presenting on how to address multiple types of losses with college-age students, specifically on the St. Bonaventure campus. This will include tips for not only counselors on campus, but also professors and those who also work with students through student affairs, such as housing. The setting, as I mentioned, is the St. Bonaventure University main campus. St. Bonaventure is housed between Allegheny and Olean in western New York, about an hour and a half south of Buffalo, and about an hour and a half north of Erie. 75% of the students live on campus. There are roughly 2,000 undergraduate and graduate students, 54% of which are female, and 46% of which are male. In their 4 years at the St. Bonaventure campus are financial losses, health-related losses, and personal financial loss could be described as any type of monetary difficulty that a student could face. Oftentimes, students will have to take out loans in order to pay for school. They may be unable to work while in school, most likely due to GPA requirements or timing. And a lot of students could be dependent on their parents who are helping them to pay for school. A common myth related to financial loss is that students will never be able to pay back their loans. On St. Bonaventure campus, 95% of students receive financial aid, meaning that some might not even have to take out loans. In addition, for a majority of our students who are from New York State, there are multiple loan forgiveness programs based on whatever profession students choose after school. Students can also experience health-related losses. The most common physical health loss is probably due to heavy alcohol use. Students that drink heavily and often over time are more likely to gain weight, have unregulated sleep schedules, have impaired judgment, and decreased motor functions. A common myth associated with drinking, especially on the St. Bonaventure campus, is that every student drinks. In reality, not every student drinks underage or even at all, and it would be important to address that with students who are choosing not to drink. Also, it would be key to inform them that there are a lot of programs on campus and off for them to seek if they decide not to drink. In addition, there are some emotional losses that students could face during their time at school. Due to increased stress from academics and perhaps from being away at home, students can have issues with anxiety and depression. Anxiety and depression could also just be common among students because they are the two most common mental health disorders in the US, especially among younger people. Students could also face personal loss through the death of a friend, perhaps from home, a family member, or a fellow student on campus. The main team members in aiding students through any type of loss already mentioned are 3 counselors that work at the St. Bonaventure campus in the Wellness Center, professors of any students, and resident assistants who work for housing. Although resident assistants are fellow students, they are hired to be members of a floor community and to foster a safe environment, thus making them a responsible team member in caring for other students. So, in order to respond to financial loss that a student might experience, all of the team members aforementioned should be involved. That includes the 3 counselors, professors of the student who might be a resource for them to talk to, and the student's resident assistant on their floor. The counselor, professor, and resident assistant could all take on the task of reviewing with the student their specific financial issue that they are facing. The specific financial issue could be a student perhaps losing a scholarship to not being able to maintain their proper GPA, or perhaps a family financial struggle that could result in a student having to then take out loans to pay for school. It would then be the responsibility of either of any of these team members to refer the student to the financial aid office in Hopkins to discuss their options. This would be the most appropriate response from any of these team members because the financial aid office deals directly with students and is trained in how to help them find a way to pay for school. In addition, on their own, a counselor could offer to go with the student to financial aid if necessary. This would only be necessary if the student has a lot of anxiety surrounding going to the financial aid office and asking questions. Possible interventions that a counselor could use with a student who is experiencing financial loss are reviewing a loan forgiveness program with the student. As I mentioned before, many of St. Bonaventure's students are from New York State, and there are a lot of loan forgiveness programs specifically in New York State for its residents. Going over some of these programs with the student might make them feel a little less anxious about how they are going to pay for their loans once they graduate. A counselor could also perform the empty chair exercise with the student. The counselor would set up an empty chair that either the student's parent or perhaps someone in financial aid would be sitting in, imaginarily of course, and that would give the student the opportunity to formulate their own questions about how to perhaps get a loan or apply for more scholarships. Prepping the student this way would ensure that they will go into their meeting with financial aid more prepared and feeling more confident in what they needed to find out. A counselor could also help the student search for on-campus employment, barring on the fact that the student has enough time to get a job. The BonaWork program is the most applicable for all students because it is not barring on financial standing at all. This is also convenient because all of the jobs are on campus, meaning the student wouldn't have to have further concerns about how to get to the job. A counselor could also encourage the student to start keeping a journal. The journal would serve the purpose of alleviating some of the personal stress the student might have, and it could also serve as a kind of financial planner. The counselor could encourage the student to track their daily spendings and how they are going to perhaps save some more money. The intervention I would suggest as a different one would be a support group. As this is a campus of all students, all of whom have to pay for school, a support group comprising of financial aid officers, a counselor, perhaps some resident assistants, and students could meet perhaps on a monthly basis to discuss financial aid planning and how students can save some of their money and more effectively. It could also aid in educating students on how to apply for loans or scholarships. General to-do tips for helping a student experiencing financial loss would be to let the student feel heard, to aid the student in finding financial aid resources on campus and online, and to assure the student that you are a source of support for them, no matter what the issue is. A not to do tip would be to go to financial aid for the student. This would not be appropriate and would strip the student of their independence in being able to solve the problem of their financial loss. Initially responding to a health loss would incorporate the 3 counselors on campus and the resident assistants. I would suggest leaving out the professors, as these health-related losses might be deemed as more personal to the students, meaning they don't want their professors to know about it. First of all, it would be appropriate for the resident assistant to inform a counselor on campus if they feel that a student on their floor is displaying very inappropriate or disturbing behavior or unhealthy behavior due to drinking or perhaps mental illness. It would be the role of the resident assistant and the counselor on campus that is working with the student to encourage the student to perhaps not drink or to take a break from drinking, or to encourage the student, if they choose to keep drinking, to do so carefully. That would involve encouraging the student to make sure they are always with friends and that they don't overconsume. It would be the role of the resident assistant and the counselor to also encourage self-care. The resident assistant or the counselor could also remind the student that they are a resource that is not judgmental of the student's actions. Interventions that a counselor could perform with a student that is experiencing a health-related loss could be encouraging the student to keep a journal. This would allow the student to work through some issues they may have surrounding alcohol or anxiety and depression. Using the journal as a springboard for conversation, a counselor in a one-on-one meeting with the student could address some of the issues that the student mentioned in their journal. For instance, if a student comes in after writing a journal saying that they feel like they are an alcoholic for drinking a few nights a week, a counselor could do some cognitive restructuring with the student and allow them to figure out that drinking a few nights a week does not mean they are an alcoholic. It could mean that their drinking patterns are unhealthy, but not that they have a disease. A counselor could also point students towards the AA meeting that happens regularly on campus that is both for students and anyone in the surrounding community. A counselor could also provide resources in the form of pamphlets, providing information on how to deal with drinking issues or addressing anxiety and depression, or they can inform the students of off-campus resources if they choose to seek them out. The Cattaraugus County Health Department provides even more mental health resources for the students if they choose to have a bit more privacy off campus. An intervention that counselors and resident assistants could encourage would be to inform students about a Richter Center Fitness Challenge. These happen every semester and would aid a student who might be experiencing health-related losses like anxiety or depression. These fitness challenges are often done with a partner, which would give the student a healthy outlet to work out while also giving it a social aspect. My intervention that I would suggest would be a new monthly floor program that would involve a counselor and resident assistants being available to students in the lounge on their floor to discuss alcohol-related issues and or anxiety and depression-related issues, while keeping it private on the floor. Students would also feel that they are making a connection with others in their community who are probably experiencing some of the same issues. My main to-do tip for a counselor or resident assistant working with a student experiencing this type of loss would be to remind the student that these are common struggles. Alcohol abuse, anxiety, and depression are all issues that affect almost every college student at some point. And reminding students that they are not alone and not alone on campus specifically would be important. My not to do tip would be to let the student feel judged in any way for their behavior or choices. Even if the actions of the student might be concerning to the counselor or resident assistant, it is important that they keep their personal opinion out of their interactions with the student. When responding to personal loss on campus, it would be important for the 3 counselors, any professors, and resident assistants to be included in the response. All of these team members would offer condolences to the student or students, depending on if it was a campus-wide loss, and it would be important for each of these team members to ensure that each other are aware of the student's loss. This would be appropriate if one student perhaps lost a parent and the resident assistant was aware of that. It then would be a good idea for that resident assistant to contact one of the counselors in the wellness center to then get in touch, who could then get in touch with the student. The 3 counselors and the resident assistants would also have the added responsibility of being available to the student or students that experience the loss. This could be in the form of one-on-one meetings or floor programming that could help multiple students. Professors could also have the added responsibility, if they choose so, to give students extensions. This would be applicable if a student lost a family member and had to attend a funeral away from campus. Although it would not be a requirement, it would certainly help the student in order to not add in any more stress when they are already mourning. Interventions that a counselor could perform with a student who is experiencing personal loss would be, again, to encourage a student to keep a journal. This would allow the student to process some of their grief and to make them more aware of the stages of grief that they are experiencing and if they are doing so healthily. This would then be helpful to use in a one-on-one session in which the counselor could review journal entries with the student. A counselor could also suggest spiritual guidance or attending a spiritual service if this is something that the student is interested in. There are many resources connecting students who are not Catholic with places of worship off campus, and those could be found through the University Ministries Center. My intervention that I would suggest to either an individual student that experienced a personal loss or to the campus community, if it was a student on campus that died, would to be to create some type of art that honored the person that had passed away. On an individual or a group basis, this could be as simple as making a painting or perhaps a large poster that incorporated words, thoughts, or feelings that the person who is experiencing the loss associated with the person that died. I think this would be especially helpful if it was a student on campus who died, because it would allow other students to know that they are experiencing the same loss and the same mourning as other students, while also getting the chance to learn more about that person. A good intervention for a counselor and a resident assistant, probably in tandem, would be a floor program immediately following a campus-wide loss. This would allow students to connect with each other through their mourning and to allow the counselor and the resident assistant to promote and encourage healthy behaviors while mourning. My to-do tip for any team member that is helping a student dealing with personal loss would be to remind the student that it is okay to grieve and to do so differently. As noted in our text, late adolescents and young adults are often not aware of quote-unquote proper mourning rituals. Due to this, it would be key for any team member to let the students know that it is okay to not know what to do when they are experiencing a loss or if a friend is experiencing a loss. In order to fully help a student, it would also be important for team members to connect with each other to keep track of the student's progress through their mourning period. It also would be important for a team member to take care of themselves, especially if the loss was one that happened on campus. My not to do tips would be to ignore the loss if it affects you. This would either be on a personal level if a student's loss was disturbing to a team member, or if the loss was on campus, perhaps the death of a student in the community. Ignoring the loss and ignoring mourning would not be helpful to any student. I also would encourage any team member helping a student dealing with loss to not judge the student for how they grieve. Again, as I mentioned, students might not know the most appropriate ways to address their feelings when experiencing the death of someone else. And telling the students they are grieving wrong or unhealthily would not be helpful to them. Although St. Bonaventure is a Catholic school, there are about 4 religions that are represented on campus in large amounts. Therefore, it would be important for any person, whether it's a counselor, professor, or resident assistant, to be aware of different religious practices. If working with Christian or Catholic students, it would be key for a counselor or professor or RA to be aware that traditionally there will be a wake first and then a service of some type, either a prayer service or a mass, followed by a traditional burial. And this would all be important to know because if it was, for instance, a death on campus of a student, traditionally enough time is left before the final burial in order for more people to be able to attend. For Hindu students, it would be important to note that the body is cremated instead of buried. There is a ceremonial washing both of the deceased and of those who attend the burial services. And also there is a shraddha, which is a formal dinner given by the family of the deceased. Being aware of something like this could be important for Hindu students that might be seeking help, as following one of these traditional practices, like a shraddha, might connect them with other Hindu students on campus and help them to grieve. There is a contingent of Muslim students on campus, so it would be important for counselors and anyone else helping to know that ceremonial washing, similar to Hindu practice, is common in Muslim burials. Generally, flowers are planted around the site of the burial, and a special meal is served by the family of the deceased. This would be important to know because perhaps Muslim students would be comfortable with planting flowers or making another memorial on campus if they were dealing with a loss. For Jewish students, it's important to know that they traditionally sit Shiva after the loss of a loved one. Shiva is a long period of time where those who are grieving do not shave or bathe and wear the same clothes and generally avoid social gatherings. And this avoidance of social gatherings lasts for a period of time after the burial. This would be important to know because if there are Jewish students who are sitting traditional Shiva, it would be important for not only the students around them, but especially their professors, to be respectful of the limitations they will have due to their grieving style. There are some developmental considerations when working with college-age students who are grieving. For instance, late adolescents and young adults, which would include students that are around 18 to 22, may not be aware of proper mourning behavior solely because they have never experienced grief themselves before and may not have been educated about it by their parents. This may seem strange, but in some cases, practice can make perfect, and students can know better how to deal with grief if they've experienced it before. In addition, young adults may view death as something that is far off and that will not happen for a long time. Generally, at least in American culture, we consider death as something that is supposed to happen to the elderly, generally above the age of 80. If a death occurs before then, say, for instance, for a student that might be college-aged, this kind of early traumatic death can have a large effect on the people that they knew. No matter what type of loss students experience or what their religious or cultural background is, it is important to keep in mind the general stages of grief. These stages will not necessarily go in order, and students might not even experience all of them. But generally, the first stage of grief is shock and denial. This would involve a student being totally unaccepting of a death of either a loved one or someone around them. This is normal at first, but if it lasted for such a long time that a student ignored a death, that would be considered abnormal grief, and they would need some help with accepting their loss. The next typical stage of grief is disorganization. And just like it sounds, disorganization would be when a student would feel a sense of loss and perhaps no direction in what they were doing. They might be unaware of how long they've been feeling a certain way, or might be unaware of how hard the loss has actually been on them. Again, this kind of loss of what's happening or not being able to make sense of what has happened is normal. The next stage is volatile reactions, and this can involve severe anger, sometimes prompted by nothing at all except grief. This anger can often be misdirected at others who are still alive. It is important to remember that although these volatile reactions might be a surprise to those around the grieving person, it is not the fault of the grieving person that they are reacting this way to their loss. The next stage would be guilt, which would involve an intense feeling of I should have done blank, or I should have said blank. Next, loss and loneliness are when denial subsides and a student could experience their loss fully and finally understand what has happened. The next two stages go together, relief and reestablishment, and they involve understanding and accepting guilt and loneliness and moving forward from a loss while still remembering fondly the person that was lost.